That is an incredible story, man. And I just thinking of anybody that's listening right now and what they would want me to ask you because there's so many ways I could approach this. But personally, I was curious, why did you call it Farmer's Edge? And when you started out, how much of an edge did you have? Was the ROI there? Could you define it? Did you have 80% of the ingredients in the baking there? Or did that really take a lot of wood shedding?
Mm. Well, how did it, I was trying to find a name, there was like, so you're going through trying to find a name that makes sense. And, there was, Grower's Edge and this edge, and, I wanted this edge thing in. And so, yeah, so kind of got stuck on Farmer's Edge and, you know, went from there. But I would say that, one of the things that, um, was always in the back of my mind was, that the data and the information that we didn't really understand what it all meant. We knew it was important, but at the early stages, the imagery layer was the main piece of the puzzle. But there was all these other components that, that were there that we couldn't figure out how to put into the pie yet, one of the things that sort of always stuck with me was, when I worked in the retail at Double Diamond, we would get these faxes that would come from DuPont about sclerotinia, and it would say, "Oh, your area is in, extreme risk for developing sclerotinia."
Mhm.
And it was like, well, we haven't had rain for 2 weeks. How could that be the case, right? I could never understand a lot of how the models and everything would work because, and and even when it came to like the soil testing and the recommendations, it would never make sense, right? It would always, we would soil test and then you would use some type of system to give you a recommendation, but then nobody would trust the recommendations. And what I realized then is, well, these models are just, formulas that you stick stuff in and it spits it out. So if you're putting in stuff that is questionable, the outcome's going to be questionable. And so that always stuck with me. And I remember, as we were building this out, I was always paranoid of the big companies. Like, what are we going to do when Monsanto decides they should do it? Because we could see the real value that was being created. Like the idea of being able to go into a field that a third of the field would always lodge and for it not to lodge anymore. And I remember John Smith, who was a seed grower growing oats. And I remember that day we had 20 farmers out there and I walked into an area of the field that we put zero nitrogen on. And you, and, and you could, and that area where it was zero nitrogen was just starting to lodge. And so with, the iPack at the time, if you can read it with FarmWorks software, we're walking through these areas and the farmers are just shocked, right? Like you put no fertilizer here. You put like 70 pounds over here and 70 pounds on oats at that time was like a big deal, right? Like how could you put 70 pounds on oats? And that was creating real value for the farmers, probably way more value than we were really understood. But the whole time we were just, we knew this was valuable. What are we going to do when the big guys come? We'll never survive against Monsanto. We'll never survive against these other guys, or John Deere, So I would say Monsanto and John Deere is what always scared me or terrified me. Um, so, and then one day I remember, um, it was before Monsanto acquired Climate Corp, but they were coming with this integrated farm management services, like where they were starting to get down the path of doing variable rate. I remember a Monsanto guy called us. We had a call with them and then it just clicked on me. I was like, I know what they're going to do. They're going to take all of this data and they're going to build the perfect prescription map, right? They're going to get yield data. They're going to get soils data. That's what they're after. And then, so that was scaring me, but I had no idea how are you going to deal with this, right? We'd taken that first investment from from Avrio, and we were growing, but you know, one day when Monsanto comes, either they're going to buy us or they're going to kill us, and there's nothing we could do about it. Um, and then when Monsanto, I remember, you know, Monsanto when they acquired Climacore, and they started to read about all the stuff about what Climacore did and big data and data analytics and all of this stuff, and I was like, oh wow, this is what they're going to do. They're not only just to make the perfect prescription map, they're going to start trying to use all this information from the farm and start kind of predicting stuff. And I realized then that probably we were the only other ones out there that had this type of information. And so we had formed kind of a board, and we had a board of directors. And I remember going to Brian Hayward, who was the chairman of our board, and saying, hey, if we're going to compete against Monsanto, we're going to have to like invest into technology. And I've got an idea that I want to be able to, because we started to dabble with pulling the as applied maps um, uh, with the X20 monitors. They were called Syncs at the time or whatever, like with modems and pulling that data in. And, you know, there's a guy that worked for us at the time by the name of Trevor Sherman, who, you know, Trevor's like a crazy visionary type person, right? Like and I, and I remember, you know, Trevor being in Winnipeg, sort of doing whiteboarding a bunch of stuff of what he thought, what this data was going to be, and from the modems and stuff. And between the acquisition of Climate Corp, between Trevor Sherman with his crazy whiteboard, which I think he actually has a picture of that he sent to me, like, you know, after I left Farmer's Edge, I think he sent me that picture of saying, do you remember this day? And I was, yeah, do I remember? Yeah. I think those pieces suddenly was like, okay, we got to go and do something about this. And so I said, so, you know, so then we sort of went to kind of go out and raise another round of financing. And so Brian said, okay, well, he goes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk to a bunch of investment bankers, and we're going to pick an investment banker, and they're going to help us raise this next round of financing. Okay, like who the hell, what's an investment banker? And so Brian started, well, so we brought in, I don't know, 10 different investment bankers. They pitched, we settled on this group called Piper Jaffray out of Minneapolis, and they literally came in from scratch and kind of built out sort of business plan, a pitch deck, financial model. We didn't have any of this kind of stuff. I was like, this is like crazy. I've never, and then a weird thing sort of happened as we went out to go and raise this money. All of a sudden, there was all this inbound interest to acquire the business. And it was like, whoa, where did that come from? And it went from like a path around raising money to a path about potentially getting the business acquired, which, you know, so all of a sudden, there was some big companies that started to show up that I think was at the very early stages of this. Some seed companies, some GPS companies, so as this was kind of going on, I got this phone call out of the blue, and by this guy by the name of Brooke Porter, and he said, "Hey, this is Brooke Porter. I'm from Kleiner Perkins," and I was like, and we're just sort of getting into this process, right? And he said, he goes, "I've heard about Farmer's Edge," and I was like, "Oh, I've never heard of you guys." And I think I insulted him because he kind of said, "You've never heard of Kleiner Perkins, Wade?" I was like, "No, I've never heard of you guys." He goes, "Well, we're the most famous venture capital firm in the world. We were the ones that invested into Google." And it's like, so I Googled their name, and I was like, "Holy shit, these guys are a big deal." And so this process was kind of going on at the same time that they sort of prospected us. And he said, you know, me and my partner, this name's an interesting name, Amol Defane, who was the founder of FBN. At the time, he was a partner with Kleiner Perkins looking at these agricultural investments. We'd love to, have another call with you. So I had a couple calls with them, told the Piper Jaffray guys, they got super excited. They were like, this is a really big deal. Like, we're really shocked that they'd be interested. Um, and then while this was going on, they said, we want you to fly down to Silicon Valley. I was like, oh, I've never been to California. I don't think I've ever been to San Francisco. So I fly down there. I go to Kleiner Perkins's, fancy office on famous Sandhill Road and I get there and I kind of go, oh, okay, well, I meet Brooke. Where's Amol? Oh, Amol doing something different now. So here's the new guy, Ben. And so we had this meeting and so as this process is kind of going on, the Kleiner guys say, look, we don't want to acquire your business. We just want to invest into it. And we think, we believe we only invest in the companies that are $1 billion businesses. So I was like, okay, well, that's super interesting,
I like that number.
and, um, and so while this process is going on, you'll think this isn't funny. So, one of the principals from that Ultima Partners, who I was at those early stages, his name Angus Selby, left, Ultima Partners and went to the Canadian Pension Fund. And then I got a phone call and Angus says, wait, Angus here, I haven't talked a long time. I'm now heading up the Canadian Pension Fund's investment into agriculture. We want to invest 10% of the portfolio into farmland, into Canada. In Canada, compared to the US, there are no farmland management groups. So somebody would go find the farmers, find the land, look. He goes, so we need to create one. So we think we want to buy Farmers Edge. So all of a sudden the Canadian Pension Fund enters into this where, this is going on. So it's like, holy, Canadian Pension Fund applies to Winnipeg. We have a big meeting. And 30 days later, the Angus phones me and says, wait, we can't do the deal. And I said, oh, how comes that? Well, we believe that there's a rule that states that non-residents can't buy farmland. And essentially the Canadian pension fund is an arm of the Canadian government. The Canadian government is controlled by the Crown, who is the Queen of England, and she's a non-resident. And we think the Bradwell government will keep us out. So we're not going to go forward. So I was, okay, fine. And knowing this whole process is going on, like we're trying to raise money, it's turning into an acquisition discussion by a bunch of big companies. You got Kleiner Perkins who have come in, and then all of a sudden pension fund comes in. So this is like blowing my mind, right? Like all of a sudden, like at the time you're trying to process all of this that's happening and run this business. And then 30 days later, another pension fund shows up, the Canadian Public, PSP they're called, and they wanted to do exactly the same thing. Exactly. And I said to the guys, well, the Canadian Pension Fund was just here 30 days ago and they don't think they can do it. What makes you think you can do it? And they said, no, we believe we can. And, so we actually had an offer on the table to acquire Farmers Edge to become part of PSP while this all was going on. And, and I'm trying to figure out like, okay, are we going to be a technology company? Are we going to be a agronomy company? Are we going to be a farm management company? The idea of investors buying farmland at the time, like pension funds and all this is like crazy. So I ended up getting cold feet with these guys. Said, look, I don't think you can do it. So I ended up turning that deal down, which was a good thing because they weren't able to do it. And then PSP now is the largest farmland owner in Australia. So they all went to Australia. Wow. But this was all happening at the same time. So two pension funds that showed interest to acquire the company. We started as a process to raise some more capital. I've got the largest venture capital group in the world knocking on our doors. then, Mitsui Corporation, the largest trading house in Japan, now is at the door. And so,
Were you sleeping?
well, so it gets even kind of crazier. So at the time, our major competitor, with Agrichem, but there was this other group called Echelon,
Right,
who
right.
was using a different platform. And the owner of that company was a gentleman by the name of Tom Staples.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
Tom called up and said, "Wait, we're going to leave our existing provider. You've got Precision Edge, which does pretty much what we want to do. Could you white label that?" And I was like, "I could do that. Yeah, why not? Like that makes sense to me." They weren't really doing precision ag the same way we were doing it. They were kind of doing without soil testing. We were kind of all in on soil testing. They were going to use our platform. So we did that deal. It was a white label. No one really knew. And their main customer was Nutrien at the time. So, so all this is kind of going on. And then we get an inbound from Viterra. And now Viterra wants to do this big partnership. And so, you know, super. So all this is going on. I'm on my way to Saskatoon. Trevor Sherman, who was with me then
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
time, we were in meeting with the brass there, and um, so the hype of variable rate had kind of got, I think, inside of Viterra. They were trying to figure this out. That was that time that Viterra was really moving and shaking. And I remember we ended up doing this deal, and it was a huge deal, right? They had made major commitments, and millions and millions of dollars. They were going to put Farmer's Edge variable rate in every location. We had this awesome strategic partner. We were getting sort of, a memo, an MOU put together, and they were very eager to push this out before the CARE convention. And I was sort of nervous about, well, what happens if we don't get an agreement? I don't want to communicate to the industry that I'm tied to Viterra and have this deal go away. So I remember saying to the counterpart, let's make this MOU binding. He went, okay, let's do that. So we made this letter MOU binding. And I'm talking, this is a major deal, like north of $20 million deal of revenue, right? Coming. So that gets fed into this process. So now I've got this major contract with Viterra that's going to give me long-term revenue. It's getting all of these acquisition people, investors all hot and bothered. And I got the world by the tail, right? It's just awesome. Then one morning I wake up and Viterra is getting bought by Nutrien and Richardson's. And I was like, oh my God, what does this mean? And so in the end, Nutrien, acquires a bunch of the fertilizer assets. They essentially acquire our agreement, but they didn't know that they had this agreement. Nutrien realized that Echelon was using Precision Edge when they acquired Echelon. And in the end, when they acquired Viterra, they acquired our agreement. So essentially, I had a contract with Nutrien by way of Echelon and by way of Viterra, now that Nutrien owned. Um, and so then I got, had to go meet with Nutrien, and Nutrien said, like, this is like a crazy contract. We don't really, and I said, we don't sign contracts like this. And I was like, yeah, you didn't sign it, Viterra did. And they said, well, we don't really like this. And I so at this time, so they said, okay, well, look, we'll just buy you. What do you want? And I was like, well, I said, we're in the middle of a process right now. And true story, like and, you know, there was numbers being thrown out at the time was $100 million. I said, well, I've got an offer at the table run. And then the Nutrien guy said, yeah, we're not going to pay that. And then the one guy from Nutrien from the States says, I got to know how this investment thing goes. If we walk away from this agreement, your investors are going to run out the door. And I was like, no, they won't run out the door. How naive I was, right? So then Nutrien kind of came back and said, look, we're gonna fight this MOU. We're not gonna adhere to this agreement. So we got into an altercation with them. And Yeah, he was right. When that happened, all the investors all said, "Hey, you know what? Call us back when you get this thing all worked out. We'll be there. But until you get that worked out, we don't." And I was like, "Holy crap!" So we went from like cloud nine, had this big contract, to then another huge company saying, "Hey, we're not now going to go forward with this." I had made major investments inside the company with people and stuff to implement this contract, and now it's not there. And now my investors are running out the door because Nutrien's not going to agree to the contract. Um,
And what year is this?
this would have been 2013.
Yeah. Yeah. 10
So I had
years
to
ago.
like, so there was about months of panic, right? Like I'm fighting Nutrien, and so we ended up settling, um, came to terms that Nutrien continued on using the the Precision Edge platform. Um, I didn't get my full contract out of it, but we got value.
So why
And
didn't you sell?
well, the buyers went away once the Agrium deal, or the Nutrien or Agrium deal at the time, when they
Oh,
questioned
so
it,
yeah,
right?
that's right. Because Nutrients, what they didn't want to give you 100 million.
Right. So when you know when Nutrien said, "Hey, we're gonna fight this contract," all the buyers turned around and said, "Whoa, you got to get
Yeah.
this settled because we are going to give you X amount based on
Yeah. Yeah. The
this
multiple of
contract."
your revenue.
Right.
20
So
million is nice for a little multiple action there.
right. So then, um, in the end, I ended up, when this all kind of got settled, the Kleiner Perkins guys phoned back and said, "So are you selling the company now?" And I had some money in the bank, and and I said, "Well, I don't know if I'm really just going to sell the company, but I've got X amount of money in the bank." And so then all of a sudden, Kleiner said, "Well, hey, we'd be interested in investing still. We're still here. We just didn't want to, we don't want to own the business. We want to invest into it." And so we kind of went down that path. A- Once all that settled down, all the acquisition, everything, I got sort of focused and said, "Okay, I'm going to build a platform where I can get data from Tractor Cab. I'm going to combine that with weather information. So I'm going to put weather stations out in farmers' fields. I'm going to put soil moisture probes out. I'm going to collect all this, and I'm going to be able to create better modeling or predictive modeling than Monsanto because I'll have better data." That was the strategy. And that's what Kleiner invested into. And when they did, and then essentially I had, then I had to go and find a way to get data to come to the tractor cab, right? So not just modems from X20s, I had to find a solution. John Deere was doing something, and that's when essentially we acquired um, the can plug, uh, and brought that in house. And then that was sort of the beginning of, Kleiner invested. I bought the can plug. That gave me the capital to deploy weather stations.
Right.
We started to put can plugs out in equipment. We started to build um, the new platform. So going from Precision Edge to a platform that could take all this data in and then serve it back to the grower. That's what that investment from Kleiner did. And that's essentially where we started to kind of go head to head against Climate Corp or Monsanto and John Deere. And that was sort of the foundation of the start. And Kleiner had invested, initial investment was 12, and then they came in at 12. I had some money in the bank from the settlement. We started to deploy. It was an interesting time because I had to sell this internally inside it, because it was like people like, weather station. Nobody wants weather stations. Like, there's a perfectly good weather station 50 miles away. Why do I need a weather station on my own field? Right? Why do I need these cam plugs? Like, and I had to, I had to kind of say, like, this is where this is going. I know you don't really want this cam plug, or you don't think your customers do, but it's getting all packaged in. This is kind of how we're gonna do it. We're gonna package it all in. We're going to get all this data and we're going to create value out of this data. Um, we actually, we were first movers on that because Climate didn't have an in-cab solution till after they bought 640. You know, there was 640 Labs, there was Farm Mobile, and then there was Crop Ventures. And we did the deal with Crop Ventures. Then Climate Corp bought 640 Labs and they brought that in-house. And at the time, John Deere was just starting, as you know, their own internal modems of collecting data at that time. And then we had to figure out how to make these cam plugs work and all this equipment, collect all the data, process all the data, and then serve it back, right? So that's essentially Farm Command became, and we were building that out, and we had to build out this huge team. And so at the time there was a group of guys at Lethbridge, Kevin Grant, and, that they had a small company. Kevin was sort of he was a prof at the University of Lethbridge. They were doing some stuff for us on the side. We ended up acquiring their business and bringing that in-house. And merging sort of what they were doing, creating that early stage of Farm Command to what Roland was doing with the cam plugs. And that's kind of how it got started. And what people don't realize at the time, this was super interesting. So, the cam plugs were sort of at this early stage where you could go out and see the equipment moving in the field and stuff. Cause I remember I saw it. We had a cam plug in a farmer's John Deere tractor south of Winnipeg. We could see the remote data moving on it. But we hadn't done it on a large scale. And, we had to we acquired Crop Ventures in kind of November. And then by the time, I remember the Kleiner investment came in, and then we had our first board meeting. And after the first board meeting with Kleiner and that was there, the Kleiner guys said, we were very skeptical that this could get done, that you could do this over the air updates and be able to constantly send software out. He goes, we know Tesla very well. And he said, the only company we've been able to see that's been able to do this has been Tesla, and now you guys. And it was just shocking. It was a huge win, Ron, had done something that the Kleiner guys were so impressed. And it was this time where I remember Kevin, we went down to meet with Kleiner, at their offices. And one of the partners for Kleiner was a guy by the name of Mike Abbott, his name was. And the name won't mean anything to you, but if you remember a long time ago when Twitter first came out, it was crashing all the time. They had all these problems. They brought Mike Abbott in to fix it. He's the guy that fixed Twitter. Hmm. And I remember Kevin Grant, he was this was Mecca to him, right? He's in this, and so this Mike Abbott's asking questions and stuff. So they asked the question of what was it like to fix Twitter? And he said it was like operating on a marathon runner in the middle of the marathon. I had to do open heart surgery. And
wow.
And these are the type of people that were around us, right? And this is what, so Kevin, who was so smart, but this was his first gig, but he was now got this exposure to Kleiner, and Kleiner was going out of their way to give us, it was like CEO tech boot camp for me. And I was down to Silicon Valley once every 2 weeks.
That's crazy.
And was learning about all of this stuff. So that was all kind of going on at that time. And so we were on rapid, and then Kleiner invested, and then Mitsui, who I took Kleiner's money before Mitsui, and then Mitsui really wanted, so then then Mitsui came in. And then when Mitsui came in, then Kleiner put more money in, and then it seemed so easy. And then, Osmington, who was David Thompson, they put money in, and then Mitsui put more money in. And then, so the period of time where, this capital raising. We were growing and growing and building something. Like, but what people don't realize is that and you could talk to 100 farmers and guys that say, "Oh, those cam plugs," and I don't really know if it's worth it or what have you. But which you could have that argument, but there was a period of time where the underlying tech of Farmer's Edge was like competing head on with Climate and John Deere, and
Wow.
CNH had nothing, right? And AGCO had nothing. And so those were the three companies that were out there. So we're spending lots of money. We were going through all this money aside. So
You were talking about how there was a snowball effect with more and more capital, but it's such an interesting time that you're talking about because I remember now those can plugs and the weather stations and what a big deal they were and how revolutionary it was. And I don't think most people recognized it when it started, but you saw that again, the potential of that.
nobody was doing it like it was. And I think it was, and the interesting part was at the time, nobody saw any value in the weather stations until after it had even like, it took almost 2 years for people to realize how variable the weather actually was. I don't think anybody understood that. And I think that what I learned out of the weather station piece, there was times that we would do a variable rate program for a farmer and the farmer would say, well, it didn't really work very good, or that part of the farm, it didn't materialize. I don't think variable rate worked.
Right.
And then when we started to put all these weather stations, I realized that, holy crap, there could be 3 inches of rain difference within 3/4 of a mile.
Yeah.
And so suddenly now where a farmer goes, well, this field didn't work, or this, it may not have anything to do with the land or the nitrogen or anything else. You just got more rain. And I don't think people ever realized that there was that much difference. I didn't, and
I sat with a producer after your presentation in Dauphin for supper and beers. And that's what he said to me. Oh, this variable rate stuff is great, but what happens then if you don't have any rain or too much rain or this and that? But you put those pieces together in the end.
well, and I think that suddenly, we didn't go down the path of the soil moisture probes as much as we wanted to. And, the group out of
South Country.
Shell Country did, right? And
Yeah.
and we actually came almost late to that party. We initially were going to put probes out, but it just was too costly to do weather stations and probes. So we went weather stations. They kind of went down the probe side of it, which then has spurred us on. And it was like, okay, well, we learned, nitrogen was really important, or fertility. Then the next stage was like, well, weather and how that played into it, and the crop staging and the model. And then it was the soil moisture. It was another like, oh my God, that's really important too. And so I think at that time of that field centric data, and, and got onto that part yet, but that whole piece of where one, I thought, okay, agronomics were critical. But in this process, some of the companies that showed up on our doorstep through this fundraising and acquisition was insurance companies, like big insurance companies, reinsurers. And this is pre Fairfax. And so suddenly now I realize is like, well, this data isn't just, for trying to sell the perfect seed variety it's also going to be a factor around how the insurance industry works. And at the time, as I started to learn, I realized it was so crazy how they did crop insurance, like, with so little information, right?
But how
And
did
so
you
that,
see the farmer's data as far as ownership went and privacy?
well, we had to think through that, right? I mean, that was one of the things that we knew how sensitive it was. And so we more or less said, look, um, the data belongs to you, but we retain the right to aggregate it and do something with it. And And if we can create new products that actually adds value to you, the better it is for you. Um, but it stuck on that line. It was interesting at the time, like Farm Mobile was out there promoting about selling the data and sharing the value back with the grower. And and for the longest time, number one, I wasn't sure that was the right business model because I would go, well, I'm not sure if I'm a farmer. Um, I don't know if I want my data being sold to all these different companies. Be and so what if I get a little bit of money for it at the end of the day? And what I believe was going to happen in my mind, I thought, and whether it's played out this way or not, I believe that the big grain companies over the last 100 years, um, you know, they made all their money off of intelligence, not off grain marketing. And what I mean by that is that um, Cargill knew what the bean crop was in South America before the North Dakota farmer knew that there was shitty beans in Brazil or Argentina or wherever, right? The larger these elevator networks were, and I think at that time, the elevators were much more speculators. So they would essentially say, oh, well, we're going to buy beans in North Dakota for $9 because we think they're going to go to 13 because there's no crop in Brazil. And how does the guy in Fargo, North Dakota know that? Right. Because there was no Twitter, and I think that that's how that industry built itself. And I could see that disruption happening because all of a sudden now is, the farmers were having with the internet as much intelligence as what the grain companies, and what the grain companies were they were the infrastructure. So they had sort of moved from, I would say, an intelligence company to an infrastructure company, right? Uh, so I think the grain companies went from speculators to like making their money on moving, but suddenly the farmer now has way more power because now he has that much more knowledge. And I could see that if you could suddenly now have that kind of at your fingertips. And so the strategy at the time was like, if we could take and at the time, at the heat of it, we were on 7 million acres. And if we could take 7 million acres of yield data and 7 million acres of fertility data and be able to do an analysis. And I started to do it for myself, right? Like, you could see this trends, or you could pick which wheat variety does better, in the Bertel Langenberg area versus, the Pilot Mound area. And the more data meant the more powerful it was. You could see like which week is better to, that gave the most ideal outcomes, would be the first week of May or the last week of April. And that only worked if you had lots of information, you're able to collect all the data and process it. One of the things that we learned quickly, and so as the company grew, we started to hire people, more executive, different companies. And one of the things that I've learned was that one of the huge issues that Deere and Monsanto were having was labeled data. So though climate was out in a lot of pieces of equipment, the farmers were looking at visually in the gap, but they weren't, being diligent about putting in that this field has this variety at this seeding, like, collecting that information. So a lot of it was getting, you know, to the company was gibberish. They couldn't determine because they didn't have good label data. And one of the things that I think Kevin Grant had taught me early on is we had some meetings with some of these companies. And so we had a meeting with Climate Corp one day, and the guy from Climate Corp said to us, we were in San Francisco. He says, I don't believe that you guys are doing all the things that you say you're doing. I don't
That's an
believe it.
interesting statement. Why did
And
they think
so,
that?
so we were at the heart of it. They had up on their screen about how many, prescriptions they had done. And, so Kevin says, well, he goes, we believe that we can do these things better than you because we have better data. And the guy goes, well, he says, explain that to me. So Kevin says, well, he goes, if you're building a house, I'll always remember this, what he said. He goes, if you're building a house, and he goes, if you don't have all the lumber to build the house by hiring, so I'll maybe back up. The guy says, I don't believe you guys can do all the stuff that you're saying. How big's your data science team? And Kevin goes, well, I know 3 of us. He says, we have 150 data scientists and da 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 da. So then Kevin says, if you're trying to build a house and you don't have enough lumber, hiring 30 more carpenters isn't going to help you. And Kevin says, we have all the right lumber. And what he was meaning is that, we've got all the labeled data, because what we were doing, and it was part of the issues with Farmer's Edge, the cost structure, right? Because we would go and meet with the grower. So we had to have a person to do that we would put all their crop plan in, and the crop plan of what are you going to do. Then we would take from the as applied data of what really happened and make sure that it was clean. Like, oh, that guy switched this field out. We'd have people and then when we had all that information, we could start to do this analytics, and we were doing it. And there was nobody else that was doing it at that time. Now we had to throw a lot more bodies at it than what most people, but I think people didn't know, what was required to go out and actually do all this stuff, and so there was powerful stuff coming, which was leading us on to these other things, right? Well, suddenly now we're like, oh, there's an insurance opportunity here, right? There's a farm finance. How do, and that was kind of like, we can win the agronomic piece, then we can move on to these others, with that, climate started to kind of like, well, they started out at $14 and then they went to $10 and then they went to like 6 and then essentially went free, right? So tough to compete against that in the US, right? We were having to go out and, and package that deal and there was a lot of people that were pushing on me saying, like, you're touching too much, right? You're not a true SaaS model where, you got, and I kept saying that, that's fine, but but if you're a complete SaaS model that the farmers don't use it in the right way and get the right information, there's no other value creation. And if you don't create any other value to the farmer, then you can't charge for it. And we don't have seed and chemical that we can turn around and say, oh, well, seed and chemical is subsidizing the tech, right? And that's what really injured the industry, is where the big companies either acquired people or they started to build it internally. And then they started, instead of using it as a business model. And I remember when Bayer acquired Monsanto, at that time, I wasn't scared of anybody out there. I felt we were like, we could raise money. We had a really good strategy. We were building out, we were growing, never as quickly as you want, but the two that scared me was Monsanto and Deere. And you would have meetings with them, right? And Deere would like brain rape you. And you would have to have the meeting because you never know what could come out of it, right? So, and Monsanto didn't really want to have meetings with you, but because they were like their own. They were like, did you ever watch the show Geronimo, the Western? One of the guys was talking about like, the type of Apache, like they're different. Like that was Monsanto. They were different. They were going down a very similar path at that time about using all this technology to do, outcome-based pricing, insurance, all these things. And then when Bayer took over, they got rid of those guys and they just killed, like they lost that. And I was like, whew, that's good. That's like, now they're kind of out of the mix. Like, that's okay if they're going to give it all away for free. We'll have to create other value beyond this And then we'll just have to worry about Deere. Well, how? And so my strategy was, I can't take Deere on head on because like you can't. So you have to go and build allies. And then that was the path towards CNH. You know, tried to dance with AGCO, never got anywhere, but CNH, they were there. And so we did that big strategic deal with CNH, which was a really big deal for us that got, you know, and then I can't take on Bear, but I'm going to go down the path of partnering with somebody that can help me. And that was the deal with Richardson's, right? And that was game changing for us when we got Richardson's and CNH. It pissed a lot of people off in the industry when I did the deal with Richardson's, because we were building out um, a dealer network at the time with those good independent dealers, right? That everybody wants. But then it was Richardson's, right? And it was like, and I know there was some of those dealers were mad and they just more or less said, look, wait, I get it. I mean, if you got to pick us over, you got to pick Richards over us, I get it. But we can't be your partner and have you partner with our main competitor. Like we just can't. Right. And so, um, looking back, I regret that and don't regret it at the same time. It's like one of those things where, and then, part of this whole play is that when you're competing against Monsanto and competing against Deere and you're building and you're growing, the amount of capital that's just required, right? Like, and, there was lots of people like, oh my God, Farmer's Edge is blowing through all this money and do, but if you compared what we were creating to the amount of money, what we were spending compared to a Bear or a John Deere, that was not like we were super capital efficient, super capital efficient. Our cost structures were higher, but, if you were going to, you know, create an insurance product, if you were going to, you know, have a predictive analytics engine that could compete against these other guys at that stage of the game, I mean, you're going to have to spend some money. And so, that, and that, what I learned through that, good and bad, it is, the venture side of it, they pick a horse and then they back it and we got back and and then I would say at the end of the day, um, I think, Kleiner, who loved me at the beginning, and Mitsu, well, there was always that, well, is Wade the right guy? Can Wade go out and do this, that farm boy, and I think, there was times that I think Kleiner would have liked me gone and not gone, but they would have liked to brought in their own manager. Right. And I knew that in this business, you can't bring somebody in that doesn't understand this, the way that I understood it or somebody else, so there were lots of that but as long as you're raising money, as long as you're safe, right? The moment that you can't raise money, off with your head. That's kind of how that whole business works. And the whole time when they invest into you, you're being measured, right? You're being looked at. And they're already trying to find your replacement.